everyone remembers that Sirius Black never got a trial. Tonight, I want to look at the smaller thing nobody talks about, which is that somebody could have simply asked him a question. Here is what happens if one person does. The rain in that little Muggle street had been falling for 6 hours, and it had washed the blood off the cobblestones long before the Ministry of Magic arrived. Amelia Bones stood at the edge of the crater with her hood up and her hands going numb. She was 31 years old. 3 weeks earlier, she had been moved to the evidence desk of the Auror office, which was where they put people who had become difficult to look at. Her brother Edgar had died in September, along with his wife and their 2 children. She had asked to see the file. There was no file. There was a single sheet of parchment with the word "concluded" written across it in someone else's handwriting, and no signature at all. She had not slept properly since. She had instead developed a habit that her colleagues found tiresome. She wrote things down. 12 dead, said the aura beside her. His name was Dawlish, and he was young and pleased with himself. 1 arrest, 1 finger, cleanest night of my life. Where is the wand? Said Amelia. Dawlish blinked at her through the rain. Whose wand? Black's wand. He was holding it when you took him. Where is it now? Dawlish had to think. That was the first thing that went wrong, and it was so small that nobody noticed it happening. He had to think, and then he pointed at a canvas sack by the wall of a butcher's shop, and inside the sack, tangled with a broken umbrella and somebody's shopping, was a wand of black walnut, 13.5 inches, unyielding. Amelia picked it up. Rain ran down it. She looked at the crater, which was 20 feet across and had swallowed the front half of a bakery, and she looked at the wand in her hand, and she asked the question that would end up rewriting the next 14 years. Has anyone checked what this wand actually did? Nobody had. Nobody was going to. The war had ended 11 days ago, and the whole country was still drunk on it. Owls were arriving at the ministry by the 100, and half of them were requests for street parties. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement had 400 open cases of murder and torture, and the man they had just dragged out of that crater had been found standing in the middle of 12 corpses, laughing so hard he could not stand up straight. That was the case. That was the whole case. Sirius Black, laughing. He was in a holding cell on level 10 by midnight, and he had stopped laughing, and he was saying the same 4 sentences over and over to anyone who came within earshot. They wrote it in the log as prisoner incoherent. What he was actually saying was this: Peter was the secret keeper. Peter is alive. Peter is a rat. Check the drains. Nobody checked the drains. Amelia Bones went back to the ministry, put the wand on her desk, and filled out Form 19, which was the request for a spell trace examination. She filled out the whole thing, including the sections nobody ever filled out, and she sent it upstairs, and she went home and did not sleep. The form landed on the desk of Bartemius Crouch Sr. at 7 o'clock the next morning. You have to understand the man to understand what happened next. Bartemius Crouch was head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and he had spent 1 year making himself into the sharpest blade in Britain. He was going to be Minister for Magic. Everybody said so. He had signed orders sending people to Azkaban without a hearing, and the public had cheered him for it, and he had discovered that he liked being cheered. He read Amelia's form twice. He was not stupid. That was the tragedy of him. He was extremely intelligent and completely certain, which is a worse combination than being a fool. He understood at once that a spell trace examination was a trap. If he refused it, and it came out later that he had refused it, then every case he had ever closed would be reopened. And he understood something else. Sirius Black was the heir of the House of Black. The Black family had lawyers who had been alive when the Wizengamot chamber was built. If he threw Black into a cell for life on the strength of a laugh, someone with a great deal of money would eventually make him explain himself. So Crouch did not refuse the examination. He did something much cleverer and much worse for him. He decided to close the case so completely that it could never be opened again. "Do the wand," he said to Amelia Bones at 7:30 that morning in a corridor without looking at her, "and requisition 3 drops of Veritaserum. If he is going to confess, he can confess in a way that no lawyer in England can argue with." Amelia said, "Sir, Veritaserum requires the authorization of the Wizengamot." "Then I shall have it by lunchtime," said Crouch. He had it by 11. That is how badly the country wanted this finished. Now, here is the thing about Veritaserum that everybody outside a courtroom gets wrong, and that Crouch, who had been inside a great many courtrooms, knew perfectly well. Veritaserum does not tell you what is true. It tells you what the person drinking it believes. If a man has been confounded, he will state the lie he was given, and he will state it with the calm and total conviction of a man reading out his own name. And a skilled occlumens, someone trained from childhood to hold their mind shut, can push against it, not perfectly, not for long, but enough to muddy an answer. Crouch was counting on both of those facts, because if Black said anything inconvenient, Crouch could stand up in front of the Wizengamot and say 2 words: "Ancient house." The Blacks taught their children to close their minds before they taught them to read. Whatever came out of Sirius Black's mouth could be dismissed as the resistance of a trained mind. He had built himself a coin that landed his way whichever side came up. Confession, conviction, denial, resistance, conviction. He had made exactly one mistake, and it was not a mistake of law. It was a mistake about people. He assumed that everyone else in the building was as certain as he was. The spell trace examination was carried out at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a windowless room by a board specialist named Corbin Yaxley. No relation to the other Yaxleys, a fact he mentioned so often that people had stopped hearing it. He laid Sirius Black's wand on a velvet cloth, touched his own wand to the tip, and said, "Prior incantato." A ghost of the last spell the wand had cast rose out of the wood. Not the spell itself, the shape of it, grey and thin, like smoke, remembering a shape. It was a stunning spell. Aimed low and to the right, Yaxley made a note. He pushed the spell back and drew out the one before it. Another stunning spell. Then a disillusionment charm. Then a spell for finding a port. Then a warming charm. He went back through 14 spells. He found no curse capable of making a hole in a street, not one. Yaxley sat and looked at his notes for a while, because he had been doing this job for 16 years and he knew what he was holding. Then he wrote his conclusion, which was 1 sentence long and which he underlined twice. The wand of Sirius Black did not cause the explosion in Falworth Street. Then he did the bravest thing he ever did in his life, which was to walk that piece of parchment down 2 floors and put it into the hand of Amelia Bones instead of leaving it in an out tray. She read it standing up. She read it again sitting down. Then she went to the crater. It was late afternoon, and the rain had stopped and Muggle policemen were still arguing with each other at the barriers, thoroughly confounded and getting more confused by the hour. Amelia walked around the hole 3 times. She had never investigated a murder. She had spent 5 years processing evidence bags, but she had read every report that crossed her desk for 5 years, which meant she had read more crime scenes than most Aurors had ever visited. The crater was not round. That was the first thing. It was shaped like a fan, wider at the far end, and the shop fronts on the eastern side were scoured clean, while the western side still had glass in the frames, which meant the curse had come from the west, which meant it had come from behind the place where Sirius Black had been standing. The second thing took her another hour. and she found it because she got down on her knees in a wet gutter with a lantern. 12 people had been torn apart in that street. Of Peter Pettigrew, the ministry had recovered exactly one item: a finger. Amelia had it brought to her in a small box, and she held it up to the light, and her stomach turned over, and she made herself keep looking. The finger was whole, it was unmarked, it was clean. An explosion that reduced 12 human beings to fragments had somehow left one finger of one wizard completely intact. And the cut at the base of it was flat and smooth, and slightly cauterized at the edge, exactly like the work of a cutting curse applied deliberately and at close range. Amelia Bones sat back on her heels in the gutter of Falworth Street and said out loud to nobody, "You cut it off yourself." Then she looked down. She was kneeling next to a drain. The grating was iron and old, and set into the curb about 9 feet from the edge of the crater, on the western side. The side the curse had come from. She lay flat on the road, which is not a thing that ministry officials did in 1981, and she held her lantern down through the bars. 12 feet below there was a ledge of brick above the water, and the ledge was covered in a soft grey film of city silt, and printed into the silt, small and neat and unmistakable, was a line of footprints, 4 toes. A long dragging mark behind each set, where a tail had trailed. They went away from the street and into the dark, and they did not come back. Caught on a burr of rust on the underside of the grating, 6 inches down, there was a scrap of cloth the size of a fingernail. It was maroon. Peter Pettigrew had been wearing maroon robes when 7 separate Muggle witnesses saw him shouting in the middle of Falworth Street. Amelia Bones went back to the ministry with a sealed jar containing a piece of brick silt, a photograph taken by a very confused ministry photographer who had to be lowered headfirst into a sewer, and a scrap of maroon cloth in an envelope. She did not take any of it to Crouch. She took it to a man who was 68 years old, had one glass eye that never stopped moving, and had been an Auror since before Crouch had learned to read. Alastair Moody looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the finger. Then he said a word that I'm not going to repeat yet. "Whose idea was the wand check?" he asked. "Mine," said Amelia. "Then you are the only person in this building doing your job," said Moody. "Sit down. We are going to be here all night, and tomorrow morning you are going to walk into that interrogation and you are going to let Crouch pour the potion himself. Do you understand me?" "No," said Amelia. "Good," said Moody. "That means you are listening properly. If we take this to him now, he buries it. He has the authority, so we let him do exactly what he already wants to do. He wants a confession that nobody can argue with. Let him get one. Let him get it in front of witnesses, and then we hand him the drain." The interrogation of Sirius Black took place at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of November, 1981, in room 4 on level 10, with 6 people present. Bartemius Crouch Sr. sat at the center of the table with his hands flat on the wood. Amelia Bones sat at the end with a quill and a great deal of parchment. Alastair Moody stood against the wall because he did not sit in rooms with only one door. 2 Aurors stood behind the prisoner's chair, and in the corner, fussing with a rack of tiny bottles and a set of brass scales, was an enormous man in a plum-colored waistcoat who had retired from teaching 4 months earlier and had not yet worked out how to enjoy it. Horace Slughorn was the finest potioneer in the country and the ministry's contracted verifier for restricted substances, which meant that when the ministry wanted to put truth serum into a human being, the law required Horace to be in the room, holding the bottle, and unhappy about it. They brought Sirius Black in. He was 22 years old. He had been in a cell for 11 days. His hair was matted, and there was a cut over one eyebrow that nobody had healed, and he was so thin already that the chains on his wrists hung loose. He looked at the 6 people in the room, and something moved behind his face when he saw Slughorn, because Slughorn had taught him for 6 years, and had once given him a bottle of expensive mead for being funny. "Horace," Sirius said. His voice was ruined. "They give you the bad jobs now, do they?" "Sit down, Mr. Black," said Slughorn, and his hands were not quite steady, and he did not look up. Crouch read the authorization aloud. Amelia wrote it all down. Then Slughorn came forward with a glass vial of something that looked like water and was not water, and he said, in a voice that had gone very flat and professional, 3 drops, not 2, not 4. Any more than 3, and the answers turn to soup, and I will not have my name on soup. Open your mouth, please." Sirius Black looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he laughed, one short, exhausted breath of a laugh, and he said, 11 days. 11 days I have been asking someone to do this." He opened his mouth. The change was horrible to watch. Amelia wrote about it in her notes years later and never quite got it right. The fight went out of his shoulders. His eyes emptied out and turned glassy and mild. The furious man in the chains simply leapt, and what was sitting there instead was a quiet, obedient thing that would tell you anything you asked. Crouch began. "State your full name." "Sirius Orion Black." "Your date of birth." "The 3rd of November, 1959. "Wait," said Slughorn. "Control question, please, as per protocol. If we skip it, the record is worthless." He leaned in. "Mr. Black, are you standing up?" "No," said Sirius. "I am sitting down." "And how many people are in this room?" 6, 7 with me." "Correct, and the potion is holding," said Slughorn. And he wrote something on his own card, and he sat back and folded his enormous hands, and he watched, because he had realized what everybody in that room was about to hear, and he was the only one who had already worked it out. Crouch went straight for it. "Did you kill Peter Pettigrew?" "No." There was a small silence. "Did you kill the 12 Muggles in Falworth Street?" "No." "Did you cast the curse that caused the explosion?" "No." Crouch's jaw tightened by about a millimeter. He turned a page. He was not worried yet. He had expected resistance, and he was building his record of it. "Were you the secret keeper for James and Lily Potter?" And Sirius Black, in that mild, empty voice, said, "No, not at the end. I was the keeper for 4 days in October, and then we changed it. I told James to change it. It was my idea. I told him that everyone would assume it was me, because everyone knew what I was to him, and that made me the obvious target, and the obvious target is the wrong choice. I said we should use somebody nobody would ever suspect. I said we should use Peter." Amelia Bones stopped writing. "They agreed," Sirius said, into the silence. "They performed the charm again on the 24th of October at the cottage, with only the 3 of us present. Peter Pettigrew became the secret keeper of the Potter's house. 7 days later, Voldemort walked through their front door. Nobody in the room had said that name out loud in about 4 years. Hearing it come out of that slack, mild mouth made one of the Aurors behind the chair take a step backwards. Crouch put both hands flat on the table again. "Peter Pettigrew is dead," he said. "No," said Sirius. "Peter Pettigrew is a rat." "Explain." "He is an animagus. He's unregistered. His form is a common rat, brown, with a stub tail. He has been able to do it since he was 15. He cut his own finger off in the street to leave something behind, and he blew the road apart to make a mess big enough that nobody would count what was in it. And then he changed, and he went down a drain. I was a dozen feet away from him. I saw the top of his tail go through the bars." The mild voice paused, and then it said, without any feeling at all, which was the most frightening part, "That is why I was laughing. Because I had spent that whole day thinking I was going to be the one who killed him, and instead, he had beaten me again. And I understood at that moment that he had beaten me for the rest of my life. It was the funniest thing that had ever happened to me. I could not stop. Amelia Bones looked down at her own hand and found that the quill had gone through the parchment. Crouch tried 3 more times, and each time he made it worse for himself, because a man under Veritaserum does not get bored and does not get caught out. He asked the same question in 4 different shapes and got the same answer in the same flat voice, and every repetition went into the record in Amelia's handwriting. And then Crouch made his last mistake of the morning, which was to ask a question purely because he was angry. How would a boy of 15 learn to become an animagus without a single adult noticing? And Sirius Black said, because there were 3 of us doing it, and we had a reason, and we did not care how long it took. It took us nearly 3 years. James went first, then me. Peter was last, and Peter needed help every single step, and we gave it to him because he was ours. 3 of you, said Crouch very quietly. You are telling me that you are also an unregistered animagus? Yes. What is your form? A dog, said Sirius Black. A big black dog. And the reason, said Crouch. You said you had a reason. What was the reason? Slughorn moved then. He actually put a hand out halfway, as if to stop the question, and then he pulled it back, because there was nothing on earth he could do about it. Remus, said Sirius, obediently, easily, ruinous. Remus Lupin is a werewolf. He was bitten when he was 4. He was alone every full moon of his life. And a werewolf is not dangerous to an animal, so we became animals so that he would not have to be alone. That is all it was ever for. And in a cell in his own mind, somewhere far under the potion, the real Sirius Black would have given his right arm to take that sentence back. The transcript of that interrogation was 41 pages long, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, Bartemius Crouch had ordered its seat. He was entitled to do that. A sealed record can be reviewed only by the Wizengamot, and the Wizengamot met on the first Tuesday of the month, and the first Tuesday of the month was 3 weeks away, and in 3 weeks, a man could be tried, sentenced, and delivered to a rock in the North Sea, and once a man is on that rock, nobody in Britain ever thinks about him again. Crouch was going to argue occlumency. He had already written the first 2 paragraphs of it in his head. The Blacks were an ancient and noble house. Their children were taught to shut their minds. Every word out of Sirius Black's mouth was a rehearsed defense, produced by a trained mind under chemical pressure, and the fact that it was fluent was itself the proof of the training. It was a genuinely good argument. On its own, it would very likely have worked. The trouble was that Alastair Moody had spent the previous night doing arithmetic. At 5:30, Amelia Bones walked into Crouch's office without knocking, put a wooden box on his desk, and took the lid off. Inside, there was a photograph of 4 small footprints in silt, 12 feet beneath a public street. There was a jar of that silt. There was a scrap of maroon cloth in a stoppered tube. There was a single sheet of parchment with one underlined sentence about a wand that had cast nothing but stunning spells. And there was a finger in a glass case, cut clean. He said check the drains, Amelia said. He said it 9 times in the log before anyone gave him the potion. It is in the log, sir, in 4 different Auror's handwriting. He was telling us where to look, and he was telling us before anybody could have coached him. Crouch looked at the box for a long time. You went round me, he said. I filed Form 19 and I followed the evidence it produced, said Amelia. There is no procedure in the department for going round you. I checked. And here is where I want to be fair to Bartemius Crouch, because it would be easy to make him a cartoon, and he was not one. He sat there with the box open in front of him, and he understood, completely and immediately, that he had a choice. He could bury it. He had the power to bury it, and the country would have thanked him. What he actually said was, who else has seen this? Moody, Yaxley from Spell Trace. Slughorn heard the interrogation. And the Chief Warlock. Crouch's head came up. You sent it to Dumbledore. Moody did, said Amelia. Last night. That was the moment. Not the wand, not the finger. That was the moment the timeline came off its rails, because Albus Dumbledore was Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, and he was the one man in Britain who could compel a hearing, and up until 11 o'clock the previous night, he had believed absolutely and with grief that Sirius Black was guilty. He believed it because he had cast the Fidelius charm himself in the middle of October, with Sirius Black named as keeper. He had watched Sirius accept it. He had offered to take the burden himself and been refused gently by a boy of 21 who said that James would rather have a friend hold it than a headmaster. So when the Potters died, Dumbledore had done the only arithmetic available to him, and the arithmetic said that the man he had watched accept that responsibility had sold it 11 days later. He had testified to that effect in writing. That testimony was in Crouch's file. It was, on paper, the strongest single piece of evidence against Sirius Black in existence. Moody's package reached Dumbledore's desk at 11 o'clock at night, and Dumbledore read it, and then he sat for a long time without moving, and then he did something that a great many people would have found beneath him. He went and asked a 21-year-old former Death Eater a question. I am not going to pretend that Severus Snape wanted to be helpful that night. He had been in Dumbledore's service for about a year. He had lost the only person he had ever cared about 11 days earlier, and he was not by any measure recovering. When Dumbledore came down to the dungeon office and asked whether the Dark Lord Circle had ever spoken of a source inside the Order of the Phoenix, Snape said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he said, "There was a name." "Tell me the name." They did not use real names for informants. There was one they laughed about. They said the Dark Lord had a friend of the Potters in his pocket, and that the man was so frightened he wept when he made his reports. Snape's mouth twisted. They called him Wormtail. Dumbledore said very quietly, "And did you know that name before you heard it from them?" "Yes," said Snape. "I heard it in a corridor at this school when I was 15 years old. Black used it. It was what they called Pettigrew." There was a long silence in that office. "Severus," said Dumbledore, "you understand what you have just done." "I have told you a fact," said Snape. "You have taken 12 years of Azkaban off a man you hate." "Yes," said Severus Snape, "I am aware." And he turned back to his cauldron and did not speak again. And Dumbledore left, and to the end of his life, Snape never once mentioned it to anybody. Sirius Black never knew. That is worth remembering later, when the two of them are standing in the same kitchen wanting to kill each other. One of them was in that room on the 11th of November, and the other one has no idea. The hearing was held on the 24th of November 1981 in Courtroom 10, in front of 50 members of the Wizengamot, with Millicent Bagnold, the Minister for Magic, sitting in the public gallery because the whole country was watching. And she was not stupid either. Crouch prosecuted, he was very good. He put his own case first, and he put it honestly, which surprised people. He read the spell trace report aloud himself, he described the drain, he described the finger, and then he stood in the middle of that floor and said the thing that had been keeping him awake. Members of the Wizengamot, everything you have just heard is consistent with a second wizard escaping that street. I do not dispute it. I put to you that we know the identity of that wizard already, and that his name is not Peter Pettigrew. He turned and looked up at the benches. There were 2 animagi in Falworth Street. The accused has admitted under truth serum that he is one of them. We have his word, and only his word, that the other one was the victim. A man capable of becoming a dog is a man capable of being in a place he was never seen entering. What if Peter Pettigrew fired that curse in self-defense and missed? What if he is under that street because he is dead under that street? A finger cut clean can be cut by anyone holding a wand, including a friend. And that, I have to say, was a genuinely frightening piece of lawyering, because it took every single piece of Amelia's evidence and turned it around to face the other way. Then Crouch played his last card. The serum cannot save him either. The accused belongs to a house that trains its children in the closing of the mind before they can write their own names. His mother taught him. I can produce 3 witnesses to that effect from the Black family's own household staff. Under Veritaserum, a trained occlumency does not become honest. He becomes fluent. He sat down. It was, by any reasonable measure, a winning morning. Sirius Black was brought in chains, and he answered questions for 2 hours, and I will not pretend he did it well, because he did not. He was furious and exhausted, and he insulted a member of the Wizengamot within the first 10 minutes. Twice, he shouted. Once he cried, which was worse for him than the shouting, because the gallery saw it. But somewhere in the middle of that second hour, a witch from the back benches asked him a question that nobody had put on any list. Mr. Black, if you were innocent, why were you in that street at all? And Sirius stopped shouting. Because I went to check on Peter, he said. That night. After. I went to Godric's Hollow first, and Hagrid had Harry, and Hagrid would not give him to me, and Hagrid was crying so hard he could not hold the handlebars of my own motorbike. So I gave him the bike, and I let him take my godson away. And then I thought, if the house was found, then the keeper was broken. So I went to Peter's hiding place to get him out. And there was no sign of a struggle, there was no blood, there was nothing broken. The kettle was cold, and the door was locked from the inside, and Peter Pettigrew was simply gone. He looked up at 50 faces. That is when I knew. Nobody had taken him. Nobody had hurt him. He had walked out of his own front door and gone to hand them my best friend and his wife and their baby, and he had done it because he was frightened, and I had told James to trust him. I chose him. Do you understand? Whatever you do to me today, I sat in a room in October, and I said, use Peter. Nobody would ever suspect Peter. Then he said, I found him in that street the next morning because I was hunting him. I am not going to stand here and lie about that under oath. I would have killed him. He got a word out before I could, and there is a hole in the road where the word landed, and 12 people are dead because I wanted to do it myself instead of bringing him here. That is mine. I will carry that, but I did not sell James. The chamber was extremely quiet. Amelia Bones, sitting at the clerk's table, wrote one line in the margin of her notes, and the line was this. He confessed to intent to murder in open court without being asked. An occlumency protecting himself does not do that. And then Albus Dumbledore, who had been silent for 2 hours, stood up. Before I speak, Dumbledore said, the chamber should understand that the strongest single piece of evidence against this man was provided by me in writing on the 2nd of November. I am here to withdraw. You could hear parchment being put down all over the room. I performed the Fidelius charm upon the Potter's home on the 16th of October, he said. I named Sirius Black as secret keeper because James and Lily Potter asked me to. That is the whole of my knowledge, and until 11 o'clock 2 nights ago, I believed it was sufficient. It was not. I made an error of a kind that I am beginning to think is characteristic of me. I assumed that because nobody had told me a thing had changed, nothing had changed. He reached into his robes and took out a letter. On the 23rd of October, James Potter wrote to me. It is 4 lines long and it is entirely about nothing. He asks after the school. He complains that Lily has hidden his broom. And then, in the last line, he asks me a technical question about charm theory, which was not a subject he had ever shown the slightest interest in during 7 years of my acquaintance with him. Dumbledore held the letter up. He asks whether the Fidelius charm can be performed a second time upon the same dwelling by someone other than the original caster. I wrote back the following morning. I told him that it could, that the second casting simply replaces the first, and that the original caster is not required and would not necessarily be informed. I told him this in a single sentence because I assumed he was being curious. I did not ask him why he wanted to know. He lowered the letter. The accused states that the charm was recast on the 24th of October. My reply reached Godric's Hollow on the morning of the 24th of October. The letter is in James Potter's hand, and it is dated. It has been in a drawer in my office for a month, and I did not think about it once. And 12 people are dead in a Muggle street, partly because an old man was too busy to ask a young one a second question. He handed the letter to the clerk. Then he said, I would ask the chamber to consider what it means that Sirius Black, under a truth serum administered by the prosecution, named a date that matches a letter he has never seen, which was written by a man who has been dead for 3 weeks and which has been locked in my desk the entire time. Crouch did not stand up. He was far too intelligent to stand up at that moment. The Wizengamot broke for 2 hours at midday, and during those 2 hours, 3 things arrived in courtroom 10. The first was a report from the Muggle Sewer Authority for that district, obtained by a very apologetic ministry liaison, confirming that no maintenance had been performed in that section for 4 years, and that any marking in the silt had therefore been laid down since the last flood in September. The second was Amelia Bones, filthy to the shoulder, carrying a bundle. She had spent the previous day and most of the night underground with 2 aurors and a lantern. They had followed those small 4-toed prints for 1.5 miles, through 3 junctions, always choosing the branch that carried the prints. And 1.5 miles from Falworth Street, on a brick shelf beside an outflow pipe, the small prints stopped. Where they stopped, in the same silt, there was a set of human footprints, bare feet, size 9. Facing away from the small prints, as though a person had appeared out of nothing and walked on. And jammed behind the pipe, folded up small, stiff with filth, was a maroon robe with the left sleeve cut off at the wrist. She put it on the clerk's table and unfolded it, and the chamber made a sound that Amelia said afterwards she never wanted to hear again. The third thing that arrived at midday was a shabby young man in a patched coat who had been sitting in a corridor since 7 in the morning because nobody had thought to give him a chair. Remus Lupin was 21 years old. He had lost 4 friends in one night. He had spent 3 weeks believing that one of them had murdered the other 3, and then a letter had arrived from Alastair Moody with a transcript in it. And he had read 41 pages and got to a sentence about a boy who was bitten when he was 4. And he had understood, before he had finished the paragraph, exactly what it was going to cost him to walk into this room. He came in and stood in the middle of the floor, and he did not sit down. "State your name and occupation," said the clerk. "Remus John Lupin. I have no occupation. Do you swear that your testimony is true?" "I do." "Then begin." And Remus Lupin, in a quiet, clear, perfectly steady voice, said, "I am a werewolf. I was bitten in the summer of 1964, when I was 4 years old, by a man called Fenrir Greyback, because my father had insulted him in public. I was registered at the age of 5. I attended Hogwarts by the personal intervention of the chief warlock, who built a place for me to be dangerous in, and I never harmed a single student. And I'm aware that saying that out loud in this room may end the only good thing that has ever happened to me." Someone on the third bench stood up and left. Nobody stopped them. "When I was 13, Remus said, my 3 friends worked out what I was. I did not tell them. They followed me. They were 13, and they were the sort of boys who followed things. And instead of doing what everyone had told me my whole life they would do, they went to the library, and they spent nearly 3 years learning to become animagi in secret, without a teacher, which is illegal and dangerous, and the most enormously stupid thing anybody has ever done for me." He looked up at the benches for the first time. James Potter became a stag, Sirius Black became a dog, and Peter Pettigrew, who was the slowest of the 3 of us at absolutely everything, and who cried the first time he managed it, became a rat. A small brown rat with a stubby tail and a bald patch on one flank. I have spent one night in every 28 in the company of that rat since I was 16 years old. I would know it in a room of 1,000 rats. I do not need to be told what Peter Pettigrew looks like when he does not want to be seen. A member of the Wizengamot asked, coldly, "And why should this chamber accept the word of a registered werewolf?" "You should not," said Remus. "You should test it." Then he turned around and looked at Sirius Black in his chains and said, "Show them, Padfoot." And there was a small argument, and Crouch objected, and Dumbledore overruled him, and 2 Aurors took the chains off the wrists of a man they were fairly sure was the most dangerous prisoner in the building, and everybody in courtroom 10 held their breath. Sirius Black stood up. He was shaking. He had not attempted it in 3 weeks, and he had eaten almost nothing, and then he was not standing there anymore. Where he had been there was an enormous black dog, shaggy and gaunt, with its ribs showing through its coat, and it stood in the middle of the floor of courtroom 10, with its head down and its sides heaving, and 50 members of the Wizengamot looked at the living proof that 4 boys in a school dormitory had done something that the Ministry of Magic officially recorded as having been achieved by 7 people in the entire 20th century. Nobody said anything at all for about 8 seconds, and then, from somewhere up on the 4th bench, a very old wizard began to laugh, and the sound of it broke the room open. The verdict took another day and a half, and it was not the clean thing you might want it to be, because the Wizengamot was not in the business of admitting that it had nearly done something unforgivable. Sirius Orion Black was cleared of the murder of Peter Pettigrew. He was cleared of the murder of 12 Muggles. He was cleared of the betrayal of James and Lily Potter, and the Chamber's finding included a sentence, inserted by Dumbledore and fought over for 2 hours, stating that the man responsible for that betrayal was named in the record as Peter Pettigrew, and that a warrant was to be issued for his arrest. And then they convicted him of 3 things he had confessed to under their own truth serum: failure to register as an animagus, assisting 2 other persons in the same offense, and unlawful pursuit of a wizard with intent to cause harm, which was the polite ministry phrase for hunting Peter through London with murder in mind. He was fined 2,000 galleons, which the House of Black could pay out of the small change in a drawer. He was placed on the Animagus register as the 8th entry of the century, publicly, with his form printed in the Daily Prophet. He was bound over to report to the Auror office once a month for 2 years. And he was disqualified for life from ever becoming an Auror, which was the only part of the sentence that made him put his head in his hands. He walked out of the Ministry of Magic at 4 in the afternoon on the 26th of November, 1981, 24 days after Godric's Hollow, into a crowd of photographers wearing somebody else's coat. Remus Lupin was waiting for him at the top of the steps. Neither of them said anything useful. Sirius said, "Your coat is horrible," and Remus said, "It is your coat. You left it at my flat in June." And then the 2 of them stood there while the cameras went off, and one of those photographs ended up on the front page under a headline that took the Prophet's editor 4 attempts to write, because there was no comfortable way to print the sentence, "The ministry nearly got it wrong." That was the good day. I want to be honest with you about that, because everything I have told you so far is the part where the system works, and it does work, and it is worth watching a system work. But the same page of the Daily Prophet that carried that photograph carried something else in a box at the bottom in smaller print. Every Auror in Britain had been reassigned. All of them. Bagnall's government had just been publicly humiliated over a case it had nearly closed with a laugh and a finger. And its response was to throw the entire law enforcement capacity of magical Britain at the one thing that would make the humiliation go away: find the rat. For 8 days in December 1981, magical Britain went slightly mad. The ministry issued a notice to every visiting household in the country. It had a picture of a rat on it. It instructed the public to report any rat exhibiting unusual behavior, and it defined unusual behavior so broadly that within a week the improper use of magic office had received 600 reports, including one from a witch in Kent, who was convinced that Peter Pettigrew was living in her airing cupboard and had eaten her hat. Every pet rat in Britain was confiscated. Every single one. They were taken to a holding facility in Devon and examined by a team of 4 ministry officials who were required to place each rat individually in a warded box and read out a revealing charm. And by the end of the month, those 4 men had personally handled 2,106 rats, and none of them was Peter Pettigrew. Visiting families in Britain stopped keeping rats, not for a year, forever. It became one of those things nobody explains to children because everybody already knows it. You do not keep a rat. That small fact is going to matter enormously in about 10 years, and I want you to hold on to it. Aurors searched 11,000 miles of sewer. They searched the docks at Liverpool, Bristol, Dover, and Grimsby. They put watchers on every international port key terminal and every flu connection to the continent, and they did all of it extremely well. And it did not work, and I will tell you exactly why in a moment. But first I have to tell you what it cost, because this is the part of this timeline that people skip when they tell it. And it is the part I think about most. On the night of the 2nd of December, 1981, 4 Death Eaters walked into a house in Lincolnshire. They had been looking for their master for a month. They were not stupid people, whatever else they were, and they had worked out that the Longbottoms had been closer to the Order's intelligence than almost anyone alive. Frank and Alice Longbottom were both Aurors. They had a son who was 16 months old. In the timeline, the response to that attack was slow. In this one, it was slower because on the night of the 2nd of December, there were exactly 9 Aurors on active duty inside the borders of Britain, and the rest of the department was underground. Frank and Alice Longbottom held their house for 11 minutes. Nobody came. They survived. I want to be careful here, because what happened to them is not something to dress up. They survived, and they were taken to St. Mungo's Hospital, and they never came home again, and their son was raised by his grandmother. The 4 who did it were caught within a fortnight because Bellatrix Lestrange was not trying very hard to escape. She wanted a courtroom. She got one, and she stood in it and told 50 people that her master would return and that she looked forward to being thanked. And beside her in the dock, weeping, 20 years old, begging his father in front of the entire Wizengamot, was Bartemius Crouch Jr. I said earlier that Crouch Sr. had made himself into a blade. Watch what happens to a blade. 9 days before his son was put in that dock, Crouch had stood in the same room and lost the black case, in front of the whole country. He had been made to look like a man who nearly buried an innocent wizard to save his own reputation. There were 2 newspaper columns already calling for his resignation. His entire remaining political survival depended on being seen to be harder than anybody else in Britain. So when his own son stood in that dock and screamed that he was innocent, Bartemius Crouch Sr. sent him to Azkaban for life, and he did it in a voice that did not shake, and he did it in front of a public gallery that he needed to impress. His wife never spoke to him properly again. Within a year she was dying, and she asked him for one thing and he gave it to her, and I will come back to that in about 10 years of story time, because it becomes the single most dangerous secret in Britain. But here is the line I want you to notice, because Amelia Bones noticed it and wrote it down and kept the note for the rest of her life. Barty Crouch Jr., in that dock, screaming, asked for one specific thing. He asked for Veritaserum, and his father refused. Now, Peter Pettigrew, I promise to tell you why 11,000 miles of sewer and every port in Britain did not catch him, and the answer is embarrassing, and it is this. They started looking on the 27th of November. Peter had left on the 3rd. He was a coward, and cowards are frequently underestimated because fear is a tremendously efficient engine. Peter Pettigrew had spent a year and a half being a spy inside a group of people who loved him, which is the hardest kind of lying there is, and it had taught him 3 things. Move early. Never be interesting. And always know where the next hole is. He had come up out of that outflow pipe on the 2nd of November, put on a stolen coat, walked to Tilbury Docks, and got into a crate of Portuguese ceramics as a rat. By the time Amelia Bones was lying on a wet road with a lantern, Peter Pettigrew was in Lisbon. He was not going anywhere in particular. That is the thing about him. He had no plan, because he had never in his life had a plan. He had a feeling, and the feeling was that the only person in the world who might still find him useful was not entirely dead. He had heard things in the last year in rooms where he was not important enough to be sent out of. He had heard that his master had done something to himself. He did not know what, and he did not want to. He had heard the word Albania. So in the spring of 1982, a small unremarkable man with a missing finger began working his way east across Europe, doing the sort of jobs that nobody checks papers for, and asking in bars and market squares and the back rooms of apothecaries, in bad Bulgarian and worse Albanian, whether anybody had heard of a place in the forest where the animals went wrong. It took him 3 years and 4 months. He found the clearing in the summer of 1985. I am going to leave him there for a while because I want you to feel the same thing that everybody in Britain felt during those years, which is nothing at all. No news, no sightings, a warrant with a picture of a rat on it quietly moved to the back of the notice board. By 1984, the Prophet was running the story on the anniversary, and by 1986, it was not running it at all. Which brings me to the argument. On the 27th of November, 1981, the day after Sirius Black walked out of the ministry, he went to Hogwarts to collect his godson, and Albus Dumbledore told him no. That conversation lasted 4 hours. It is one of my favorite scenes in this entire timeline, and there is not a single spell cast in it. Dumbledore's position was this. On the night of the 31st of October, Lily Potter had died, refusing to step aside, and in doing so she had left something in her son that Dumbledore had spent 3 weeks studying and could barely believe. He called it a charm of the oldest kind. Voldemort had aimed a killing curse at a 1-year-old child, and the curse had come back and destroyed his body. And the reason was Lily. And that protection, Dumbledore said, could be anchored. It could be extended and renewed and made into a wall around the boy on one condition. It had to be rooted in Lily's blood, not her husband's line, hers, which meant her sister. Petunia Dursley, said Sirius. Yes. Petunia Dursley, who sent Lily a letter when Harry was born. And the letter said, I quote, because James read it out at the time, and I have never forgotten a word of it. Kindly do not involve us in your business. Yes, said Dumbledore. You want to give James Potter's son to a woman who hated his mother for being magic. And I am to do what? Wave? I want him alive at 17, said Dumbledore. The man who killed his parents is not dead, Sirius. His body's gone. He is not gone. And there are people currently at liberty in this country who will spend the next 15 years looking for that child, and I can make him unfindable, and I can only do it in one house in Britain. And Sirius Black said, then make me unfindable. There is a very long silence in this scene. I like to imagine Dumbledore actually stopping, which is not something he did often. You performed the Fidelius charm on a house 4 weeks ago, Sirius said. It did not fail. It has never once failed in recorded history. It was betrayed. The magic did exactly what it promised, and a man walked out of his own front door and gave it away. And that man is the only reason you are standing there telling me the charm is not good enough. The charm requires a keeper, said Dumbledore. Yes, said Sirius. You. Another silence. You offered, said Sirius. In October, James told me. You offered to take it, and he said no because he wanted a friend to hold it instead of a headmaster, and he was wrong and it killed him. And I am the one who told him to hand it to the wrong friend, so I am the last man alive who is going to make that mistake twice. Take it. You are the only person in Britain that thing would not break. And Albus Dumbledore, who was accustomed to being the cleverest person in every room he entered, found that he had just been out-argued by a 22-year-old who had not slept in a month, using his own charm and his own offer. He did not agree straight away. He was not that kind of man either. What they ended up with, after 4 hours, was a compromise that neither of them liked. And it went like this. Harry James Potter would live with his godfather. The house would be under the Fidelius charm with Albus Dumbledore as secret keeper, and the number of people permitted to know its location would never exceed 6. And for 1 fortnight every summer, Harry would live at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, in the house of his mother's sister, and he would be told that it was his home, and he would sleep there and eat there, because Dumbledore had worked out that the blood charm did not require love or kindness or even willingness. It required only that the child called that house his home, and it renewed itself each time he returned. 14 nights, said Dumbledore. Every year, until he is 17. It is not much. It is 14 nights a year with people who will hate him, said Sirius. Yes, said Dumbledore. It is the ugliest bargain I have ever made, and I would make it again. And one day he may ask me why, and I will tell him the truth, which is that I could not think of anything better. They shook hands on it on the 28th of November. Then Sirius Black went to Hogwarts Hospital Wing, where a 1-year-old boy was asleep in a cot that Madame Pomfrey had transfigured out of a chair, with a cut on his forehead that had already stopped bleeding and would never, ever heal. Sirius stood there for a while without picking him up. I do not know how to do this, he said. No, said Dumbledore. Nobody does. That is not a reason to refuse. The house they ended up in was in a village in Yorkshire, at the end of a lane, and it had 4 bedrooms and a wild garden and a roof that leaked over the landing. Sirius bought it in January 1982 for cash, and Dumbledore performed the Fidelius charm on it on a Tuesday morning with nobody watching, and from that day forward, the house at the end of that lane did not exist to anybody who had not been told about it by Albus Dumbledore. 6 people were told in the end: Sirius, Remus, Minerva McGonagall in case of emergency, Alastair Moody for the same reason, Rubeus Hagrid because Sirius insisted, and because a man who cries at a motorbike deserves to know where the baby lives, and Amelia Bones. That last one surprised everybody, including Amelia. You do not know me, she said, on the doorstep, in the rain, in the February of 1982. You are the only person in that entire building who did their job, said Sirius Black. If anything happens to me, I would rather he was found by somebody who checks. Now, the thing nobody warns you about when you save a man from Azkaban is what he does with the rest of his life. Sirius Black was 22. He had been the best duelist in his year at school. He had been an Order of the Phoenix field agent for 2 years, and extremely good at it. He wanted to be an Auror more than he had ever wanted anything, and the Wizengamot had taken that off the table forever as the price of the truth about a dog. So instead, he was a man in a leaking house in Yorkshire with a toddler, and it nearly destroyed him. I want to be honest about the first 3 years, because there is a version of this story where a pre-Sirius Black is simply happy. and I do not believe it for a second. He had lost James, who had been half of him since he was 11. He had lost Lily, who had been the only person who ever told him off in a way he could hear. He had chosen Peter, and now he was alone in a silent house with a small child who woke up screaming most nights and could not tell anybody why. He was, by every account, a disaster at it. He fed Harry chocolate for breakfast. He forgot bath night for a fortnight. In March 1983, he enchanted a toy broomstick to hover at 18 inches and left the room, and Harry, aged 2.5, got it up to 12 feet and put his head through a window, and Sirius Black sat on the floor of St. Mungo's with blood on his shirt and shook for an hour. What saved them both was that Remus Lupin had nowhere to go. Remus had stood in courtroom 10 in November 1981 and said the word werewolf out loud into the public record, and there is a straight line from that sentence to the rest of his life. Before the hearing, he had a small flat and 2 days a week of shop work and a reference from Dumbledore. Within a month of the hearing, he had none of it. 14 employers turned him down in 1982. 2 of them were polite about it. In the July of that year, Sirius came home from an argument with a bank goblin and found Remus asleep at the kitchen table with Harry asleep on his chest, and a stack of 14 rejection letters weighed down with a teaspoon, and Sirius Black read all 14 of them standing up in his own kitchen, and then went outside and shouted at a tree for 10 minutes. Then he came back in and said, "Move in." "No," said Remus. "There is a cellar," said Sirius. "It is stone. It has a door that opens from the inside, which is the important direction, and I checked. 12 nights a year I will be a dog, and you will not be alone, and the rest of the time you can make sure that child eats a vegetable, because I have not managed it once. Sirius, I am a werewolf, living in a house with a baby. You are a werewolf who spent 3 years teaching Peter Pettigrew to be a rat because he was too frightened to manage it on his own," said Sirius. "I have thought about it for 8 months, and I am not asking." Remus Lupin moved in August 1982, and he stayed for the rest of the story. And if you want the single clean difference between the timeline, and this one, it is not the trial. It is that Remus Lupin spent the 1980s in a house where somebody was pleased to see him. He was the one who taught Harry to read. He was the one who made the rules. He was the one who explained, when Harry was 5 and asked why Uncle Mooney went down to the cellar and locked himself in, that some people carry an illness that they did not choose, and that the important question about a person is never what happens to them but what they do about it. And every 28 days, a big black dog went down those stairs with him. And every 29th morning, Harry Potter came down to breakfast and found 2 exhausted men pretending nothing had happened, and by the age of 8, he had entirely stopped believing them. In the March of 1985, Walburga Black died alone in a house in London that nobody had entered for 6 years. Sirius did not go to the funeral. There was not really a funeral, but the House of Black does not permit its heir to refuse it. And in the April of that year, Sirius Black stood in the hall of number 12, Grimmauld Place, for the first time since he was 16 years old, holding his own son's hand because Harry was 4, and had thrown a tantrum about being left behind. The hall smelled of dust and dead flowers. There was a row of shrunken house elf heads on the wall. Harry Potter, aged 4, looked at them with enormous interest and said, "Are those real?" And Sirius said, "Do not look at those. We are leaving in 10 minutes. And they were in fact there for 6 hours, because of Creature. The house elf came out of the kitchen doorway when they had been in the hall about a minute. He was ancient and bent and filthy, and he looked at Sirius with such concentrated loathing that Harry hid behind his godfather's legs. "The blood traitor," Creature said. "The blood traitor in my mistress's house, and she is not cold a month, and he brings the Potter boy into her hall. Creature will not. Creature cannot. Oh, my poor mistress." And in the timeline, this is where it goes wrong. In the timeline you know, Sirius Black spent 12 years in Azkaban and came out of it with the temper of a man who has been screamed at by dementors for 4,000 nights. And he looked at Creature and he heard nothing but his mother's voice coming out of a small hateful mouth, and he treated him accordingly for the rest of his life, and it killed him. That is not an exaggeration. That is precisely what happened. This Sirius Black had lost 11 days, not 12 years. So he stood in that hall, and he was every bit as angry, and he opened his mouth to say something unforgivable. And then his godson tugged on his sleeve and said, in the loud, clear voice of a 4-year-old, "Why is he crying?" Sirius looked down. Then he looked back at Creature. The elf was crying. He had been crying, on and off, for 6 years, and no living person had noticed, because the only 2 people who came into that house were a woman who screamed at portraits and an elf who screamed back. "Creature," said Sirius, in a voice he did not entirely recognize as his own. "When did my brother die?" The change in the elf was instant and terrible. He went grey. He put both hands over his face. "Creature cannot say. Creature must not tell the family. Master Regulus said, 'Do not tell the family. Do not tell my mother what I did.' And Creature promised. Creature promised." "Regulus told you not to tell the family," said Sirius very slowly. "Yes, but you were with him." "Creature cannot say." Sirius Black knelt down on the filthy floor of his mother's hall in front of a creature he had despised since he was old enough to know the word, and he said, "Was it quick?" And Creature howled. They stayed 6 hours. Harry fell asleep on a sofa under a dust sheet, and what Sirius got out of it, in the end, was not the story, because the elf physically could not tell him the story. What he got was 3 facts that Creature was able to say without breaking his orders. That Regulus Black had died in the summer of 1979. That he had not been killed by Aurors, or by the Order, or by any of the people the family had blamed. And that at the end, he had been carrying something that belonged to the Dark Lord, and that Creature had failed to destroy it, and that he had been trying to destroy it every day for 6 years, and that it would not break. Sirius Black went home that night and wrote a letter to Albus Dumbledore. It was 2 pages long. The last line said, "He's not allowed to tell the family. You are not family. Ask him." Albus Dumbledore came to number 12, Grimmauld Place, on the 2nd of May, 1985, and he sat on the floor of a filthy kitchen for most of a night with a house elf. And he was gentle, and he was patient, and he asked the right questions in the right order, and at about 4 in the morning, Creature told him everything. A cave on a cliff by the sea, a wall that opened for blood, a black lake with things in it, an island with a basin on it, and in the basin, a potion that had to be drunk to the bottom before you could touch what lay underneath. And that made you see the worst things you had ever done while you drank it. A boy of 18, ordering his house elf to force it down him, cup after cup, so that the elf's hands would not have to. A locket taken out of the basin and a false one put in its place. Water full of hands, an order given, gasping, from the edge of an island. Take it home, destroy it. Do not tell my mother. Go. And an elf disapparating with a locket in his fist because his master had commanded it, and leaving his master to be dragged under because his master had commanded that too. Dumbledore came up out of that kitchen at dawn, carrying a heavy gold locket with a serpentine S on the front, wrapped in a cloth, held at arm's length. He said one sentence to Sirius Black on the doorstep, and Sirius did not understand it for a decade. Regulus Black was 17 years old when he worked out what his master had done to himself, said Dumbledore, and 18 when he died trying to undo it. When your godson is old enough, I should very much like to be the one who tells him about your brother. Then he went away, and he took that locket to his office, and he spent 9 years trying to open it. While Albus Dumbledore was carrying a locket up out of a kitchen in London, Peter Pettigrew was standing in a clearing in northern Albania, in the dark, being extremely sick. He had found it by accident in the end, the way he found everything. He had been sleeping in a barn, and the farmer's dog would not go past a certain line of trees, and Peter had spent 4 years learning to pay attention to animals. The forest went wrong about a mile in. The birds stopped. Then the insects stopped. And in a clearing where nothing had grown for 4 years, something that was not a snake and not a shadow came out of the ground and looked at him, and Peter Pettigrew fell on his face in the dirt and wept with what I am fairly sure was relief. "Wormtail," it said, "my lord, you are late. Master, I have looked for you for 3 years and 4 months. I have crossed 7 countries. I have been hunted every day since Halloween. They know what I am, my lord. They know my form. The whole of Britain knows. I cannot go home." There was a long silence in that clearing, and then the voice said something that Peter had not been expecting, and that changed the shape of the next 10 years. Good. Because here is the thing that Voldemort understood in that moment, lying in the dirt of a foreign forest, with no body and no hands and no wand. In the timeline, Peter Pettigrew spent 12 years asleep in a boy's pocket in Devon, believing his master was gone and being perfectly comfortable about it. He was found by accident in 1994 and dragged back into service kicking. In this timeline, the Ministry of Magic printed his face in the newspaper, put a warrant on his head, and made him the most wanted man in Europe. And in doing so, they removed from him every single option except one. Voldemort had spent 4 years as a fragment of a thing in a forest, unable to hold a wand, unable to speak to anyone who would not run away. He had possessed snakes and small animals and lost them. He had needed one servant, one pair of hands. And the British Ministry of Magic, in a fit of embarrassed enthusiasm, had spent 6 weeks personally guaranteeing that the only pair of hands in the world he could get would have nowhere else on earth to go. They gave him Peter Pettigrew, gift wrap, in 1985. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole engine of this story. Justice was done in courtroom 10, genuinely done. A man who was innocent walked free, and a man who was guilty was named. And the cost of naming the guilty man out loud was that he went looking for his master 9 years early and found him. That is not an argument against doing the right thing. I want to be very clear about that, because it would be a stupid moral for a story to have. It is an argument that doing the right thing is not free, and that anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you something. They did not rush. That is what frightens me about the next 6 years. Voldemort had, for the first time in his life, no ability to act quickly, and so he learned to plan slowly, and he turned out to be extremely good at it. By the autumn of 1986, Peter had built him a body, not a real one, a small, weak, hairless thing about the size of a child that could not walk far and had to be carried and had to be fed on a potion made of snake venom and unicorn blood. It had a mouth, it had eyes. It could hold a wand for about a minute before its hands began to shake. It was hideous, and it was enough. They spent 1987 and 1988 in a farmhouse in Albania, learning what had happened to Britain from newspapers, which are a great deal more useful to a patient man than most people realize. They learned that 14 Death Eaters were in Azkaban, that Bellatrix Lestrange was among them, that the ministry was run by a woman called Millicent Bagnold who was tired, and that the man most likely to replace her was a junior official called Cornelius Fudge, who was so plainly a fool that Voldemort read his first interview twice for the pleasure of it. And in the autumn of 1988 they read, in an article about the 10th anniversary of nothing in particular, that Harry Potter was being raised in an undisclosed location by his godfather Sirius Black under the personal protection of Albus Dumbledore, and that the location was hidden by the Fidelius charm. That should have been the end. A properly cast Fidelius charm with Albus Dumbledore as keeper is not a lock you pick. It is not a wall you climb. There is no clever way in. Voldemort tried for about a year, and there was nothing. And then he stopped, and he did the arithmetic, and he laughed until he choked, because he had just realized something that made the entire wall irrelevant. The boy was 8 years old. Visiting children in Britain go to Hogwarts at 11, all of them, without exception, on the 1st of September, and they arrive by a train that leaves from a platform in London at 11 o'clock in the morning, and everybody in Britain knows it. "We wait," said Voldemort. They had 3 years. They used every day of it. Meanwhile, in a leaking house in Yorkshire, a boy was growing up, and this is the part of the story where I have to be careful, because there is a lazy version of it, in which everything is lovely, and it was not lovely, it was just better. He had a godfather who took him flying at 7 and taught him to swear at 8, and forgot parents' evening entirely. He had Uncle Mooney, who was cleverer than both of them, and who marked his spelling. He had Hagrid at Christmas and Minerva McGonagall at birthdays, standing very upright and disapproving of the cake. And every August, for 14 nights, he had Privet Drive. The first one he actually remembered was the summer of 1986, when he was nearly 6. Sirius apparated onto the front path of number 4, with Harry's bag over his shoulder, wearing dragon-skin boots and a coat with silver buttons, and knocked on the door of a house full of people who had spent 5 years pretending magic did not exist. Petunia Dursley opened the door, saw him, and tried to close it. "Mrs. Dursley," said Sirius, with his boot in the gap, "I have a letter from Albus Dumbledore, a court order from the Wizengamot, and a very strong personal desire to be somewhere else. 2 of those 3 things are on your side. Take the boy." She took him. Every year she took him, and she was never kind, and she never once hit him, and Dudley Dursley learned by the age of 8 that this particular cousin arrived for a fortnight every summer and left again, and that if you pushed him, he would push back, because he lived in a house with 2 grown men who thought a bloodied nose was a normal Tuesday. 14 nights a year. That is all it took to keep a wall standing around him. Harry Potter never knew what it was for. He thought it was a punishment for something, and Sirius never corrected him, because Sirius could not think of a way to explain it that did not sound like a lie. And there was one more thing in those years that I have to tell you about, because it comes back. Every year, at the end of July, Sirius Black wrote a letter to a house in Lincolnshire. He wrote the first one in 1982, and it was 4 lines long, and he did not send it. He wrote one every year after that. In 1987, he finally sent one, and it went to Augusta Longbottom, and it said that on the night of the 2nd of December 1981, every Auror in Britain had been in a sewer looking for a rat, and that the reason they were in the sewer was a case with his name on it, and that he was aware of what that meant, and that he was not asking for anything. She wrote back 2 sentences. My son and his wife were Aurors, and they knew what the job was. Do not write to me again about this, and do come at Christmas. The boy has nobody his own age. And so from the Christmas of 1987, twice a year, a small round-faced nervous boy called Neville Longbottom came to a house in Yorkshire that officially did not exist, and he and Harry Potter blew up a shed together, and neither of them ever forgot it. 2 other things happened before the 1st of September 1991, and both of them happened in Albus Dumbledore's office. The first was that in the November of 1986, he invited Horace Slughorn to dinner and asked him a question about a conversation he had once had with a boy called Tom Riddle. And Horace Slughorn went the color of old paper and said he could not recall it. And Dumbledore, watching him, understood 2 things at once. That Horace remembered it perfectly, and that whatever it was, Horace had spent 40 years being ashamed of it. He asked 6 more times over the next 8 years. Slughorn said no every time. The second was that the locket would not open. Dumbledore tried everything he had. He tried Parseltongue, which he could read but not speak. He tried Fiendfire in a warded chamber and nearly lost the room. He put a blade to it and the blade broke. And slowly, across 5 years, in a locked drawer with a diary he had not yet seen and a ring he had not yet found, a theory assembled itself in the mind of the greatest wizard of the age. And the theory was so obscene that he refused to write the word down anywhere in the castle. He was almost entirely right. He was missing one number. He did not know how many there were. Harry Potter's Hogwarts letter arrived on the 24th of July, 1991, and he already knew what it was because he had known what it was since he was 4, which meant that the great scene of wonder that some children get was replaced by something quieter and, I think, better. They went to Diagon Alley on the 2nd of August. All 3 of them. Sirius bought him an owl he had not asked for, and Remus made him buy the second-hand cauldron instead of the copper one. And there was an argument in the middle of Flourish and Blots about whether a first year needs a book on advanced hexes, which Remus won, and which Sirius resolved that evening by buying the book anyway. And in a narrow shop at the end of the street, an old man with pale eyes handed Harry Potter his 5th wand of the afternoon, and warm red sparks came out of the end of it, and Mr. Ollivander did not smile. 11 inches, he said. Holly, with a phoenix feather core. Curious. Very curious. Why curious? Said Harry. Because the phoenix who gave the feather in that wand gave one other, said Ollivander. Only one other, and its brother, Mr. Potter, gave you that scar. Sirius Black, standing by the door with his arms folded, went absolutely still. He did not say anything about it in the shop. He said something about it that night, in the kitchen, to Remus, after Harry had gone up to bed with the wand under his pillow, like an idiot. Ollivander told him his wand has a brother, Sirius said. A brother that belongs to a dead man. Remus Lupin looked at him across the table for a long moment. He is not dead, said Remus. No, said Sirius. I do not think he is either. 9 days later, Harry Potter got on a train. I have to tell you about the boy who got on that train, because he is not the boy you know, and the difference is not a good one. Harry Potter at 11 had been loved for 10 years by a man who had never once been told no in his life. He was confident. He was funny. He had a great deal of money in a vault at Gringotts, and he had been taken to see the inside of it. He had flown a real broom at 400. He had never in his life been made to feel small. And he had a temper, and he was a little bit vain. And when he walked down that train corridor at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of September 1991, he was aware that people were looking at him, and he liked it. Sirius Black had raised James Potter's son, and had accidentally raised James Potter, and neither of them had noticed. He found a compartment with a tall, thin boy in it, who had a smudge on his nose and a rat-eaten trunk with somebody else's initials on it. And Harry sat down and said hello, and within about 4 minutes, he had said the following sentence. Is that your wand? It looks like it has been sat on. Ron Weasley went scarlet to the ears. It was my brother Charlie's, he said. It works. I only meant it looks old. Yes, it is old. That is what second-hand means. Ron looked out of the window with his jaw set, and there was a silence in that compartment that lasted about 20 minutes, and Harry Potter sat in it and slowly understood that he had done something. He was not, underneath everything, a cruel child. He had simply never had to think about what a sentence cost. So at some point past Watford, he said, out loud, to the window, "That was a horrible thing to say, and I do not know why I said it." And Ron Weasley, who had 5 older brothers, and therefore an extremely well-developed instrument for detecting a genuine apology, said, "It is all right," and then, after a moment, "It really has been sat on." Fred did it in July. That is how they started. It is worth noticing that in this timeline, Harry Potter had to earn Ron Weasley, and that the friendship was better for it, because it began with Harry finding out something true and unflattering about himself in the first hour. He met Hermione Granger about 40 minutes later when she came in looking for a toad on behalf of a small crying boy, and Harry said, "Neville," and stood up, and Hermione Granger stopped dead in the doorway and looked at the scar on his forehead and said, "Oh, you are him. There is a chapter about you in modern magical history. I read it 3 weeks ago. I've read all of the books. Is that rude?" "That was rude." "It was a bit," said Harry. "Sorry," said Hermione, and then immediately, because she could not help it, "But is it true that you cannot remember any of it?" The Sorting Hat took a very long time over Harry Potter, and what it said to him, it said only to him, and he did not repeat it to anybody for 4 years. "Now, this is interesting," it said. "You are not frightened of anything, not one thing. Do you know how unusual that is in a child of 11? Most of you arrive here terrified of not being wanted." It was quiet a moment. "You have never been unwanted for a single day. That is a gift, and I am not going to tell you it is not. But I will tell you the price, because nobody else will. You have never once had to ask yourself whether you are as good as you think you are. And there is a part of you that would enjoy finding out in front of an audience. There is a house that would put you on a stage for that. You would do extremely well there, and it would make you smaller." "Then put me somewhere else," said Harry Potter. "Yes," said the hat, sounding almost pleased. "That is the correct answer. Gryffindor." He was in Gryffindor with Ron and Hermione and Neville, and the first 2 months were, by the standards of this story, entirely ordinary. He was good at flying, and average at charms, and hopeless at herbology, and Neville was the best in the year at herbology, and nobody was more surprised about it than Neville. And Severus Snape hated him with a purity that Harry found genuinely bewildering. I want to spend a minute on that because it is different here. The Snape you know looked at Harry Potter and saw James's face and Lily's eyes and a boy who had been raised in a cupboard which he did not know about and would not have cared about. This Snape looked at Harry Potter and saw James's face, Lily's eyes, and 10 years of Sirius Black. And Harry, unlike the boy you know, answered back, fluently, with his godfather's timing. They were, from about the 3rd week of term, engaged in a private war that a member of staff should have been ashamed of and that a boy of 11 was much too pleased with. He was in detention 7 times before Christmas, and that is why nobody believed Ron Weasley in October. It happened in the corridor outside the Great Hall. Ron stopped walking. Harry took another 6 steps before he noticed. "There was a rat," said Ron. "There are probably lots of rats. It is 1,000 years old, Ron." Ron Weasley stood in that corridor and said something that only a child raised in a British wizarding household in the 1980s would say. "No," he said, "there are not." And then he explained, and Harry Potter listened, and it was the first time in his life that Ron Weasley knew something that Harry did not. Because Ron had grown up in a house with a notice on the pantry door. It had been there since before he could read, and his mother had never taken it down, and it had a picture of a rat on it. Every wizarding child in Britain had that notice somewhere in their house. Nobody kept rats. Nobody had kept a rat for 10 years. Molly Weasley had been given one in 1981 by a neighbor and had handed it to a ministry official in a box within the week. And Fred and George's favorite game between the ages of 4 and 6 had been Rat Patrol, which involved Percy crying. "You do not understand," Ron said. "In a wizarding building you do not see a rat. Ever. They wore them out. Every house, every shop, every school. Because of the poster. It was probably a mouse. It had a tail like a rope, and it went sideways round the corner at the end, and it looked at me," said Ron. And then, because he had 5 brothers and knew when he was losing an argument, he stopped talking about it. 9 days later he saw it again on a windowsill on the 4th floor, and this time he got close enough and he came into the common room white to the lips and sat down and said, "Harry, it has got 4 toes on the front left." Hermione Granger looked up from her essay. "What did you say?" She was in the library for 6 hours the following day. Here is what Hermione Granger found at the age of 12 in a public reference section without being told a single secret by anybody. And I want to be clear that every word of it was on a shelf where anyone in Britain could have read it at any point in the previous 10 years. She found the Register of Animagi for the 20th century, which was a slim book because there were 8 names in it. She found the 8th name, added by order of the Wizengamot in November 1981, and its form listed as a large black dog, and the name was Sirius Orion Black. She found the Daily Prophet for the 27th of November 1981, and the front page, and the photograph of 2 young men on a set of steps. And she found the Ministry Warrant Notice, reprinted every year until 1986, and then not reprinted, for the arrest of Peter Pettigrew, unregistered animagus, form recorded as a common brown rat. Distinguishing feature, the absence of 1 toe on the front right foot, corresponding to the finger recovered from Falworth Street. She carried all 3 of them back to the common room and put them on the table in front of Harry Potter and said, "Front right." Ron said front left, which means Ron saw a rat with all its toes and this is nothing, or Ron got left and right the wrong way round, which people do constantly, and it is nothing to be embarrassed about, Ron. Ron Weasley looked at the warrant notice for a long time. "It was front right," he said. "I said left because I was looking at it from the front." Nobody said anything for a while. "Right," said Harry, standing up. "I am writing to Sirius." And this is the moment where the timeline could have turned, and I want you to remember it, because it is going to hurt. He wrote the letter. It was a good letter. It said everything it needed to say, and it named the corridor, and the windowsill, and the toe. He took it up to the owlery himself at 8 o'clock in the evening on the 6th of November 1991, and sent it with a school owl, because Hedwig was molting, and Hagrid had told him not to fly her. The owl was found on the 11th of November on the roof of a greenhouse, with a broken wing and no letter. Peter Pettigrew had been in that castle since the 2nd of September. He had spent 10 weeks doing nothing but watching, and one of the things he had watched every single evening was the owlery. Harry wrote a second letter on the 12th and gave it to Hedwig at dawn and stood at the window until she was out of sight, and that one got through, and Sirius Black read it in a kitchen in Yorkshire on the morning of the 13th of November and was at the gates of Hogwarts 50 minutes later. So the adults did believe them. I want to be fair to everybody. Sirius believed it instantly. Dumbledore believed it within an hour. Alastor Moody arrived that evening, and they searched that castle for 4 weeks with everything they had, and they did not find him. And the reason is one of the ugliest facts in this whole story. Hogwarts Castle has 142 staircases, 1,300 rooms, 4 miles of pipework, and 1,000 years of holes. You cannot ward a rat out of a building where the rat has already been living for 10 weeks and knows every crack in it. Moody put down 62 detection charms. Peter Pettigrew learned the location of all 62 of them within a fortnight by the simple method of watching a paranoid old man walk around. And there was one other thing that Moody could not have known. Peter had help. Severus Snape was the first person to notice it, and he noticed it because he had spent a year of his life in rooms full of people using the Imperious Curse, and he knew what it looked like from the inside. Quirinus Quirrell had come back from a sabbatical year abroad in the summer of 1991, nervous and stammering, and everybody had a theory about it, and everybody was wrong because there was nothing wrong with Quirrell in September. There was something wrong with him from the 8th of November. He lost words in the middle of sentences. Twice he stood up in the staff room and then could not say why. On the 2nd of December, he marked 39 essays with the same 3 comments in the same order, and when Snape asked him about it, He said he could not remember doing it at all. Snape went to Dumbledore on the 4th of December and said, "Somebody is riding Quirrell." Dumbledore had Quirrell brought to his office that evening, and there was a conversation that Quirrell attended and did not participate in, because a man under a well-cast imperious curse who has been ordered to appear normal will appear normal and will fight quite sincerely to defend the person controlling him. They got nothing out of him. Dumbledore removed him from duty. Dumbledore did not remove him from the castle because he wanted whoever held that curse to keep using a channel that was being watched. That was a reasonable decision. It was a good decision. It was the wrong one. On the 11th of December, at 4:10 in the afternoon, Professor Quirrell walked into the Gryffindor common room, which he had no business doing, and said to Harry Potter, in a perfectly clear voice with no stammer at all, "Potter, your godfather has been hurt. He's at the gates. Come now." And Harry Potter, who was 11, and who had never in his life been afraid of anything, and who loved that man more than he loved being alive, went. He got about 40 feet down the corridor before Ron Weasley caught up with him, and Hermione Granger caught up with both of them at the top of the stairs. "He was not stammering," said Hermione. "Harry, he was not stammering." "I know," said Harry, and kept walking. And that is the thing about being 11. He knew. He went anyway. There was no version of him that waited in a tower while somebody told him Sirius was bleeding at the gates. What he did do, and I think this is the most impressive thing he did all year, was to say, at the bottom of the stairs, without stopping, "Ron, go and get Hagrid. Not a teacher. Hagrid is closest. Go." Ron went. The gates of Hogwarts were open, and there was nobody at them. Quirrell walked them out through the gates and 30 yards along the outside of the wall to the edge of the forest, where the trees came down close, and Hermione Granger was saying, "Professor, where is he, Professor? This is not the way to Hogsmeade," in a voice that got higher every step, and Quirrell said nothing at all, because he had run out of instructions. A small man came out from between the trees. He was going bald. He was wearing a coat too big for him. He had a wand in his right hand, and the hand had 4 fingers on it. "Hello, Harry," said Peter Pettigrew. Harry Potter had a wand in his pocket and 10 weeks of charms lessons and a temper, and he had that wand out and a disarming charm halfway out of his mouth before Peter Pettigrew had finished the second syllable of his own name. He was very fast for 11. It made absolutely no difference. Peter Pettigrew had been a spy in a war. He blocked it without moving his feet, and then he did 3 things in about 4 seconds, and every one of them was efficient and none of them was brave. He disarmed Hermione Granger and broke her wrist with the fall. He put a body bind on Harry Potter and lowered him onto the frozen ground with a gentleness that was somehow the most frightening part of the whole encounter. And then he knelt down beside a boy who could not move, and he pushed his sleeve up and he said, "I am sorry. I know you will not believe me. I am, though. I held you when you were 4 days old." He cut Harry Potter's left forearm open with a small, careful curse, 4 inches deep, and he filled a glass vial with the blood, and he stoppered it, and he put it inside his coat. Then he stood up and turned around and looked at Quirinus Quirrell, who was standing at the edge of the trees with his arms by his sides, and Peter said in a small voice, as though asking somebody to pass the salt, "I am sorry about this as well." He killed him where he stood. That was the first man Peter Pettigrew ever killed on purpose, with his own wand, having thought about it first. 12 people had died in Falworth Street, and he had not looked at any of them. He looked at this one. He was sick afterwards, in the trees, 20 feet away, which did not help Quirinus Quirrell in the slightest. And then Rubeus Hagrid came round the wall at a dead run with a crossbow and a boarhound, and Ron Weasley on his heels, shouting. And there was a bullet in the air, and Peter Pettigrew was already a rat, and already gone into the roots of the Forbidden Forest, and no power on earth was going to get him out of there before dark. Harry Potter woke up in the hospital wing 9 hours later with 26 stitches in his arm that magic would not close, because a cutting curse made with intent leaves a scar, and he has that one still. Sirius Black was sitting beside the bed. He had a bruise on his cheekbone from where Moody had physically stopped him going into the forest at 9 o'clock at night. "He said he was sorry," said Harry. "I know," said Sirius. "He always is. That is the whole of him. He is sorry the entire time, and it has never once stopped him. Why, my blood?" And Sirius Black, who did not know, and who had a horrible cold feeling that Dumbledore did know, said the only honest thing available, which was, "I do not know yet, but we are going to find out, and I am going to be there, and so is Moony." That is not a promise about being brave. That is just where we are going to be standing. 10 days later, on the night of the 21st of December, 1991, in a churchyard in a Yorkshire village called Little Hangleton, a small man dug up the bones of a Muggle who had been dead for 50 years, put them in a cauldron the size of a bath, cut off his own right hand at the wrist, and poured in 4 inches of an 11-year-old boy's blood. Bone of the father taken without consent. Flesh of the servant given willingly. Blood of the enemy forcibly taken. At about 2:30 in the morning, a tall, thin man with red eyes and no nose stepped out of that cauldron onto the frozen grass of a churchyard and stretched out his long white fingers and looked at them and breathed and laughed. Lord Voldemort had a body again, 3.5 years earlier than he ever managed it in the timeline, you know. Harry Potter woke up screaming in Yorkshire with his scar splitting open on the first night of his Christmas holidays in a house that did not exist. I could tell you that everybody believed him. 14 people believed him. Albus Dumbledore believed him, and Minerva McGonagall, and Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin, and Alastor Moody, and Amelia Bones, and Severus Snape, and Hagrid, and Molly, and Arthur Weasley, and 3 others, and a boy of 11 with a scar on his arm. Cornelius Fudge did not. I am not going to spend long here, because you already know how this part goes, and it went the same way for the same reasons. The Minister for Magic had been in office for 18 months. The country had been at peace for 10 years, and the alternative to disbelieving one boy was telling an entire country that the war was starting again, and Cornelius Fudge was constitutionally incapable of it. But there was one difference, and it mattered enormously, and her name was Amelia Bones. She had spent 10 years climbing. In the January of 1992, she was deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and by the September she was head of it, because Bartemius Crouch Sr. had been quietly moved sideways into international magical cooperation years earlier and never recovered, and because Amelia Bones was the only senior official in Britain with a public reputation for being right when it was inconvenient. She could not make Fudge act. She could sign requisitions. And for the next 2.5 years, every safe house the Order of the Phoenix used, every emergency portkey, every Auror who mysteriously happened to be off-duty on a night when he was needed elsewhere, went through the desk of a woman who had once lain down in a wet gutter with a lantern. Voldemort took his time. This is the thing about him in this timeline that I find genuinely frightening. In 1981, he had been a man in a hurry, and being in a hurry had cost him his body and 10 years. He came out of that cauldron in 1991, having had 6 years lying in the dirt of a forest, with nothing to do but think about it, and what he had decided was that he would never be in a hurry again. So he did not announce himself. For 2.5 years he built in silence, and the Order chased shadows. 9 Death Eaters came back to him in the first 6 months. Lucius Malfoy came back in the February of 1992 and was made to crawl the length of a drawing room in his own house before he was forgiven, and then was made to hand over a small black diary that he had been keeping in a drawer for 11 years and which he had been thinking quite recently of using. Voldemort took that diary back and looked at it for a long time and understood that his most trusted lieutenant had come within a season of destroying a piece of his soul out of stupidity. And from that day, he began, slowly, to gather his Horcruxes in, which was the single greatest mistake he made in this entire timeline. And in the August of 1992, the Order of the Phoenix nearly won the war in one night. And lost. Snape brought the intelligence. The diary was still at Malfoy Manor, in a cellar, waiting to be collected. Dumbledore did not yet know the word for what it was, but he knew a locket that would not open, and he knew now that there was a diary that Voldemort treated the same way, and two of a thing is a pattern. 11 members of the Order went into Malfoy Manor on the night of the 9th of August, 1992. Voldemort was waiting for them. Not because Snape was betrayed. Because Voldemort had told exactly one person that the diary was in that cellar, and had told him on purpose, and had then sat in the dark for 12 days to see who came. He did not suspect Snape specifically. He suspected everybody, always, and he had built a test that would catch anyone. That is what a patient enemy does. They got the diary. Emmeline Vance died on the stairs. Alastor Moody lost most of the use of his left leg and never walked properly again. Sirius Black took a curse across the ribs that Remus Lupin held together with his hands for 4 minutes in a hedge in Wiltshire while they waited for a portkey to activate. And Lord Voldemort learned, that night, the one fact he most needed and least wanted, which was that Albus Dumbledore was hunting his Horcruxes. He adapted. He was extremely good at adapting. He moved what he could move. He set new guards. And in the autumn of 1992, he did something he had not done in nearly 50 years, and which he had promised himself he would never do again, because he had already split his soul as many times as the number pleased him. He made another one out of the only living thing in the world he had ever been fond of, and after that, the snake Nagini never left his side, and nobody on the other side had the faintest idea it had happened for 2 more years. In the January of 1993, the Dementors of Azkaban opened the doors and leapt. They had guarded that rock for 400 years, and they leapt in a single night because something had offered them a better arrangement, and there were 19 people inside who walked out onto the beach and were gone before the Ministry knew. Bellatrix Lestrange had been in there for 11 years. She came out of it with a laugh that people who heard it remembered for the rest of their lives. That was the night Fudge could no longer pretend, and the war became public, and I am going to stop giving you months now, because for 18 months this is a war, and wars are not made of dates. Here is what those 18 months contained. The Ministry held. That is worth saying, because in the timeline, you know it did not. It held because Amelia Bones was running magical law enforcement 2 years earlier than she ever got the chance to, and because Alastor Moody, who could not walk, sat in a chair in a training room for 18 months and taught 400 Aurors how to stay alive. Hogwarts stayed open. Children kept going to school, and the school kept them. And Minerva McGonagall walked those corridors at 2 a.m. every night of the war with her wand out. And nobody who was there ever heard her raise her voice once. And a boy went from 12 to 14 in the middle of it. He was not a hero in those 18 months. He was a schoolboy who kept getting told to stay in the castle. He fought twice, and both times he was there by accident. What he actually did was learn, at a rate that frightened his teachers, and stay up too late and be furious most of the time and grow 4 inches. And he found out in the March of 1993 what he was. Dumbledore did it in his office with a small grass snake in a box, and it took about 4 seconds. Harry Potter looked at that snake and asked it in a language he did not know he was speaking, whether it was cold, and the snake said yes. And Harry turned round to a room containing his headmaster, his godfather, and Severus Snape, and found all 3 of them standing very still. That is how they got into the Chamber of Secrets. It took 11 months to find the entrance, because the only clue was that the founder who spoke to snakes had built something and that a girl had died in 1943. And Hermione Granger did most of the work in a library on a rota with Ron Weasley. And Ron Weasley was the one who worked out that the bathroom nobody used had been out of order since 1943. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley went down there in the February of 1994 with Albus Dumbledore and Fawkes and the Sorting Hat, because Dumbledore would not let a boy of 13 go down a pipe alone and would not stop him going either. The basilisk was 60 feet long, and it had been alone for 51 years, and it was Ron Weasley who shouted the warning that made Harry shut his eyes at the right second, and it was Albus Dumbledore who blinded it, and it was Harry Potter who put the sword of Gryffindor through the roof of its mouth because he was the one who happened to be underneath it. When the hat gave up the sword, he got a fang through the arm. Fawkes cried on it. He was in the hospital wing for a week, and they came up out of that chamber with something that nobody in Britain had possessed for 1,000 years, which was a means of destroying a piece of Lord Voldemort's soul. The diary went first, in the chamber, on the spot. Harry Potter drove a basilisk fang through the cover of a small black notebook, and the thing inside it screamed like a person, and then it was silent forever. The locket went second, 3 days later in Dumbledore's office. It had sat in a locked drawer for 9 years. It fought. It said things to Sirius Black about his brother, out loud, in Regulus's voice, that made a grown man leave the room, and then Harry Potter put a fang through it, and Creature, the house elf, who had insisted on being present and had been given a chair, put his face in his hands and made a sound like a kettle. He had failed for 15 years. He watched it break. Sirius Black knelt down on the floor of the headmaster's office in front of a house elf for the second time in his life and said, "He would have wanted you to see that." And then, in the April of 1994, Albus Dumbledore went to a ruined shack in Little Hangleton on his own and found a gold ring with a black stone in it under the floorboards and put it on. He was not stupid. He was the cleverest man in the country. He had spent a decade learning what these objects did to people who touched them. He put it on anyway because the stone in it showed him his sister, and he wanted for one moment to say something to her that he had been waiting 95 years to say. He got the ring off. He destroyed it with the sword that afternoon. And Severus Snape spent 9 hours that night stopping a curse in Albus Dumbledore's right hand from reaching his heart. And at the end of it, he stood up and said, 13 months, perhaps a little more. I can slow it. I cannot turn it round. 13 months is a great deal, said Dumbledore, looking at his blackened hand. 13 months is very nearly enough. I have to go back 13 years now for one scene because it is time. In the winter of 1982, a dying woman had asked her husband for one thing. Bartemius Crouch Sr. had taken his wife to Azkaban to visit their son, and they had given the boy her hair and given her his, and she had died in a cell in his place within the week, and Crouch had buried a small coffin outside the walls with his son's name on it, and taken home a 21-year-old murderer who was legally dead. For 12 years he kept Barty Crouch Jr. in an upstairs room under an imperious curse, and told nobody, and was slowly eaten alive by it. In the June of 1994, somebody came to that house. A small man with a silver hand who had been sent because Lord Voldemort had spent 2 years going through ministry records looking for anomalies and had found a grave with no body in it. By the end of that month, the curse had changed direction. Barty Crouch Jr. was walking around free with his father's face available to him whenever he needed it, and Bartemius Crouch Sr., head of International Magical Cooperation, was sitting in an upstairs room being told what to say. For 9 weeks, the Death Eaters had a man inside the Ministry of Magic who could read anything. And on the 3rd of September 1994, Bartemius Crouch Sr. broke it. Nobody knows how. It is not supposed to be possible to break a well-cast imperious curse from the inside, and he broke it. And I think it is not a coincidence that he broke it on the day his son sent him to sign an order about the transport of Azkaban prisoners. He got out of the house. He walked 6 miles. He came into the atrium of the Ministry of Magic at 9:20 in the morning in a dressing gown with grass in his hair in front of 400 people, and he could not make a sentence come out in the right order because that is what 9 weeks under the imperious curse does to a mind. Amelia Bones came down to him herself, and Bartemius Crouch Sr. took hold of her sleeve with both hands and said the only thing he could get out whole, "Veritaserum. Give me Veritaserum. You will not believe me otherwise. Give it to me." She gave it to him, 3 drops in a cup in the middle of the atrium with 100 witnesses and no paperwork at all. And she did it in about 90 seconds. And afterwards, she was formally reprimanded for it, and she framed the reprimand. He talked for 2 hours. He told them everything. His son, Allah. His wife's grave. 9 weeks of documents. Names of 4 officials under the imperious curse. And they got all of it. Every word. And by that evening, the Ministry of Magic had been cleaned out for the first time in 3 years. His son came for him that night and got to him. And it is not a nice story, and I am not going to tell it. I will tell you the last thing Bartemius Crouch Sr. said before the potion wore off, because Amelia Bones wrote it down. Somebody asked him why he was so certain that they would not believe him without the serum. And he said, "Because in 1981 a man stood in front of me and told me the truth for 11 days and I did not check. And because my son asked me for this in a courtroom, and I said no." 6 weeks later, Bellatrix Lestrange came through the wards of a house in Kent and killed Amelia Bones in her own kitchen. They found her in the morning with her wand still in her hand and a bookcase of case files behind her, and one of those files, right at the front where she had kept it for 13 years, was labeled Falworth Street. Sirius Black went to the funeral. He stood at the back and did not speak to anybody. And on the way out, he said one sentence to Remus Lupin, which was, "She did not know me. She had never met me. She just wanted it done properly." The war was going badly by the spring of 1995. I am not going to dress it up. Voldemort had a body, 6 years of preparation, 19 freed Death Eaters, and a public that was terrified. Dumbledore had a blackened hand, 13 months of life, and 3 Horcruxes left to find, and he did not know where any of them were. And then on the 4th of April 1995, Sirius Black caught Peter Pettigrew. It was not a great battle, it was a farmhouse in Wiltshire, and an order raid that went right for once, and 9 people, and at the end of it, Peter Pettigrew was on his knees on a stone floor in a broken kitchen with a silver hand, and Sirius Black was standing over him with a wand at his throat. Remus Lupin was 6 feet away and did not say anything. He has never said what he was thinking. I have my own opinion. They stood like that for a long time, and then Sirius Black said, "Get up, you are going to the ministry." "Sirius," said Peter. "Sirius, please, they will give me to the Dementors. They will give you a hearing," said Sirius Black. In courtroom 10, on the record, with 50 people watching and a clerk writing it all down. He was shaking, and his voice was not steady, and he did not lower the wand. "You will get a hearing, Peter, and a lawyer, and 3 drops of the same potion they gave me, and every single thing that you say will be written down and checked. That is what you are getting. That is more than you gave James, and it is more than I nearly got. And I am not going to be the one who breaks it. Get up." He took him in alive. The hearing of Peter Pettigrew was held on the 19th of April 1995 in courtroom 10, and Horace Slughorn came out of retirement for the 2nd time in his life to stand in the corner and hold the bottle, and his hands shook again, and this time he did not mind it at all. 3 drops. Control question. And then 2 hours, and every word of it went into the record in a clerk's handwriting. And here is what magical Britain learned that afternoon from the mouth of the man who had done it. That the Dark Lord had returned in a churchyard in Little Hangleton on the 21st of December 1991, using the bones of his father and the blood of Harry Potter. That there were 19 Death Eaters and the names of all of them. That the Dark Lord had, in the autumn of 1992, done something to his snake, and that Peter Pettigrew had held the knife and did not know what the spell was for, but that the snake had never been out of his master's sight for a single hour since, and that the Dark Lord had said, once, in a temper, in front of a servant he had forgotten was in the room, that Albus Dumbledore had taken 2 things from him, and that there were 4 left, and that 4 was enough. 4 was enough. Albus Dumbledore, sitting in the cheap warlock's chair with a black hand hidden inside his sleeve, did the arithmetic in public and did not move a muscle. Peter Pettigrew was sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban, in a lit cell with no Dementor within a mile of him, because there were no Dementors on the Ministry's side anymore. He is still there. He was fed twice a day and given books he did not read for the rest of his life, and he outlived nearly everybody in this story. And I genuinely cannot decide whether that is justice or not. He got the trial that Sirius Black almost did not get. I think that is the point. I think a system is only worth anything if it works for the guilty as well, which is an extremely annoying thing to be true. And it is true anyway. Albus Dumbledore died on the 11th of May 1995 in his own bed at 4 in the morning, with the curse in his hand finally reaching his heart. I want to be clear that nobody killed him. That is the difference, and it is a large one. He had 13 months and he used all of them, and at the end of it he was 113 years old and out of time, and he had 3 days of knowing it was coming, and he spent all 3 of them talking. He talked to Minerva McGonagall for 6 hours. He talked to Sirius Black for 2, and I would give a great deal to know what was said, and all Sirius ever repeated of it was, he apologized to me, for 1981. He said he had made an error of a characteristic kind, and I said he had made a good many worse ones since, and he laughed so hard I had to give him water. And on the last night he talked to Severus Snape and gave him a job, and the job was the worst one available. He is the 7th, said Dumbledore. I have been almost certain for 2 years, and I have been entirely certain since he spoke to a grass snake in this office. When the curse rebounded in Godric's Hollow, a piece of what was in that room came away and went into the only living thing left. It has been in his forehead since he was 15 months old. It is why he sees what the snake sees. It is why he speaks the language. Then he cannot survive it, said Snape. He can, said Dumbledore, because of a vial of blood in a churchyard 4 years ago, which was the single greatest mistake Lord Voldemort has ever made, and he does not know he has made it. His body is holding Lily Potter's protection now. While Voldemort lives, Harry cannot be killed by him, but the fragment can. It has to be the same hand, and the boy has to walk to it, Severus, and not fight, because it has to be freely given or it protects nobody. Severus Snape stood in that room for a long moment. You want me to tell a boy of 14 to stand still and let it happen? I want you to tell him the truth, said Albus Dumbledore, and then let him decide, because he is not mine and he never was, and I have spent 14 years being extremely careful not to make him mine. He has a godfather. He has Remus. He has 2 friends who went down a pipe with him. He will not decide it alone. That is why I built it this way. Then he said, Severus, I have never thanked you for the 11th of November, 1981. And Severus Snape said, No, you have not. 2 things happened in the 3 weeks after the funeral. The first was that Horace Slughorn walked into the headmistress's office unasked and told Minerva McGonagall about a conversation he had had in 1943 with a 16-year-old boy who had wanted to know whether a soul could be divided more than once and how many times, and whether 7 was a number of particular power. He had carried it for 52 years. He said it in about 4 minutes. Then he sat down and cried, and Minerva McGonagall gave him a handkerchief and said, "You have just told us the number, Horace. Do you understand what you have just done? 7. Diary, locket, ring, cup, snake, a 14-year-old boy, and one more that nobody had accounted for. The second thing was that Severus Snape told Harry Potter the truth in an empty classroom at 11 o'clock at night on the 2nd of June, badly and coldly and completely, because that was the only way he had." Harry Potter listened to all of it without saying a word. Then he went out into the corridor and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall for about 20 minutes. Then he went and found Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger and told them because Dumbledore had been right about him, and the three of them sat in the common room until 4 in the morning, and Hermione Granger cried, and Ron Weasley did not say anything at all for nearly an hour, and then said, "Right. Then we have to get the other 3 first, and we have to do it before he ever gets near you, because if he never gets near you, then it does not matter what is in your head." Which was, as a piece of strategic thinking, wrong. And as a piece of friendship, it was the best available thing in the world, and Harry needed it more than he needed a correct answer. Lord Voldemort came to Hogwarts on the night of the 20th of June, 1995, because Albus Dumbledore was dead, and he had waited a week out of pure enjoyment. He came with 51 people and the snake, and he did not sneak. The battle lasted 5 hours and 40 minutes. I am not going to give you all of it, because a great deal of it is just people being brave in the dark, and there is no way to tell you about all of them at once. Here is what I can tell you. 211 students were evacuated through a passage from the cellar of a sweet shop, and every one of them got out, because a portrait had told a headmistress about a tunnel in 1993, and she had written it down. 42 students of 17 and over refused to go and were allowed to stay, and 7 of them were in that year's Hufflepuff 7th year, and I mention that because people forget. Ginny Weasley, 13 years old, was ordered into the tunnel and got out of it twice, and the second time her mother caught her by the collar in the Great Hall, and Ginny Weasley said, "Everyone I have got is in this building." And Molly Weasley looked at her for a second and then said, "Then stay behind me and do not stop moving," which is the most Weasley sentence ever spoken. Alastor Moody sat in a chair at the top of the marble staircase for 4 hours because he could not walk, and held it. And one of the people who came up those stairs at him was Barty Crouch Jr., and Moody had been waiting 13 years for that specific conversation. It was very short. Remus Lupin fought on the 7th floor, and the moon was 7 days past full, and I mention that because I know somebody is counting, and I have counted too. Severus Snape stood in the entrance hall in front of 19 Death Eaters who had believed for 4 years that he was one of them, and let them find out otherwise, and he was still standing at the end of it, which surprised him more than anybody. Harry Potter spent the first 2 hours of that battle in the Room of Requirement with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger digging through 50 generations of hidden rubbish, because at 9:30 that evening, his scar had opened up, and for about 4 seconds he had been standing in a stone circle somewhere far away, checking on something with a feeling of triumph. And then a cold, sick jolt of doubt about a room in a school. They found it under a broken cabinet at 11:20, a tarnished silver diadem with a blue stone in it. Hermione Granger put a basilisk fang through it, and it screamed and split, and that was 4. Bellatrix Lestrange and Sirius Black found each other in the Great Hall at about 1 in the morning. They were cousins, and she was 8 years older than him. They had grown up in the same houses, at the same enormous horrible family dinners, under the same portraits. She had taught him to play chess when he was 10, and she had cheated. "Little cousin," she said, "are you still pretending?" "Are you?" said Sirius Black. She was better than him. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy to pretend otherwise. Bellatrix Lestrange was one of the 3 finest duelists in the country, and she had 11 years of Azkaban and 4 years of war behind her. And Sirius Black was a man of 35 who had not been allowed to be an Auror and had spent 14 years being somebody's father. It went on for 4 minutes. He was cut twice, and at the end of it, she was on the floor of the Great Hall with her wand 10 feet away, and she was still laughing, and Sirius Black stood over her with a wand in his hand and made, for the second time in his life, the same choice. "Get up," he said. "You are going to a courtroom." And Bellatrix Lestrange stopped laughing and looked at him with something that was almost curiosity and said, "You have got so boring." They took her alive. When they searched her, there was a small golden cup with 2 handles inside her robes, which she had been carrying against her ribs for 18 months because her master had told her to keep it on her person, and she had been proud to be asked. Hermione Granger destroyed that one too, 40 minutes later in a broom cupboard with her hands shaking. 5. And at 3:10 in the morning, Harry Potter walked out of the castle on his own. He did not tell anybody. That is not entirely true. He told Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger in the Great Hall about 90 seconds before he went, and Ron Weasley took hold of the front of his robes with both hands and did not let go for a long moment, and Hermione Granger said one sentence, and it was, "Come back." He went across the grounds. He went past the greenhouses and the place where the gates were and the 30 yards of outside wall where a man had once cut his arm open. He was 14 years old. He had a wand in his hand and he put it in his pocket, and that was the decision. All of it, right there. Lord Voldemort was waiting in the trees with a snake and a dozen people, and he did not gloat for long, because he had learned patience, but he had never learned much about pleasure. Harry Potter did not raise his wand, that is the whole of it. He stood there and looked at the man who had killed his mother and did not raise his wand, and a green light came out of a wand made of yew, and a boy fell over in the leaves. And something else fell out of him, screaming, and died in the roots of the Forbidden Forest, and nobody in the world saw it happen. 6. Harry Potter woke up about 90 seconds later, face down in the leaf litter, with a headache and no scar pain for the first time in 14 years. Because there was a vial of blood in a cauldron in a churchyard in 1991, and a small frightened man had done exactly what he was told. And Lord Voldemort had been carrying Lily Potter's protection around inside his own body for 3.5 years without ever once understanding what it was. Nobody at the castle knew. That is the part I find hardest to tell you. For 19 minutes, everybody in that building believed Harry Potter was dead, because Lord Voldemort walked up to the doors of Hogwarts with a body carried in front of him and put it down on the flagstones of the entrance hall. Sirius Black got about 4 feet before 6 people held him. Neville Longbottom got further. He got all the way to the middle of the floor, which nobody expected, least of all him, and there was a snake, and there was a sword lying under a suit of armor where Minerva McGonagall had dropped it 40 minutes earlier, and a boy of 14, who was the best in his year at herbology and had never won a fight in his life, picked it up and took the head off Nagini in one swing. 7. And Lord Voldemort, for the first time since 1943, was mortal, and did not know it, and turned around in a fury to kill the boy who had done it. Harry Potter was already on his feet by then. He had been on his feet since the moment the body he was supposed to be hit the floor. But Voldemort did not fire at Harry. That is the thing people get wrong when they tell this story. He had put a killing curse into Harry Potter 20 minutes earlier, and it had not worked, and he was not going to fail in front of 50 people twice. He turned and he looked for the thing that would hurt most. And he found a man of 35 with grey in his hair being held back by 6 people. And he said, "Then him first," and he did it. Green Light crossed the entrance hall of Hogwarts and stopped 4 inches from Sirius Black and turned around and went home. Because that is what happens. It happened in a cottage in Godric's Hollow on the 31st of October 1981, when a woman stood in front of a cot and would not move. And it happened again in the entrance hall of Hogwarts School on the 21st of June 1995, for exactly the same reason. And the second time it was a boy of 14 who had walked into a forest with his wand in his pocket 90 minutes earlier and given everybody in that building the only protection that has ever worked. Lord Voldemort died on his own floor, from his own curse, with no piece of himself left anywhere in the world to catch him. And the thing I love most about this timeline is what happened 11 days later. There was a hearing. Of course, there was a hearing. 38 surviving Death Eaters were tried in courtroom 10, one at a time, over 14 months, with lawyers and clerks and witnesses, and 3 drops of Veritaserum administered by a fat old man in a plum waistcoat who had never once in his life imagined he would be the most important potioneer in the history of British justice. Bellatrix Lestrange got a trial. She spent most of it laughing. Every single one of them got a trial, and it was slow, and it was expensive, and the prophet complained about the cost, and Minerva McGonagall wrote a letter to the editor that got framed in the ministry's law library. Remus Lupin was appointed Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts in the September of 1996, openly, with his registration printed in the school's own announcement, because Minerva McGonagall wanted the argument and got it, and won it. Severus Snape stayed at that school for another 20 years and never became a nicer man. And once a year, on the 30th of January, somebody would notice that he was not in the castle, and nobody ever asked. Creature the house elf cooked in a clean kitchen in a house in London, with a photograph of a boy in Slytherin robes on the wall above the stove, and lived to a spectacular age. And Sirius Black was 35 years old, with a scar across his ribs and a godson going into 5th year, and the ministry offered him, in the September of 1995, by unanimous vote, a full reversal of his 1981 disqualification and any post in the Auror office he cared to name. He turned it down. "I have got a boy doing his ordinary wizarding level exams," he said. "Ask me in 3 years." They asked him in 3 years. He said yes. He is in the record as the 8th registered animagus of the 20th century, and there is a photograph of him in the corridor outside courtroom 10, standing on the steps of the ministry in somebody else's coat on the 26th of November, 1981. The plaque under it does not say his name. It says the question that a 31-year-old witch asked in the rain on the 11th of November, 1981, in a Muggle street with a hole in it, while everybody around her was busy celebrating. Has anyone checked?